The ordinary flight that would change everything. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the airport windows as passengers bustled through the terminal, dragging suitcases and shuffling papers. Flight 326 from Chicago to Los Angeles was boarding, and the crew was already running final checks. Among them was Laura, a newly hired flight attendant, meticulously ensuring that everything was in place. This was her third solo flight since completing training, and her nerves were still on edge. She wanted to impress her supervisors and stick to protocol. After all, every flight presented opportunities for something to go wrong. The passengers began filing into the aircraft. Some were chatting animatedly about vacations and work trips, while others wore the stoic expressions of seasoned travelers. As Laura greeted them at the door with her best practice smile, she assessed each passenger without even realizing it, a habit ingrained during training. "Welcome aboard," she said warmly to a woman carrying a baby, her voice adjusting automatically to convey reassurance. "Your seat is to the left, just past the wing." Her smile faltered slightly when a tall man in a plain gray suit stepped forward. He carried nothing but a worn leather briefcase and a sense of quiet detachment. He nodded politely but didn't return her smile. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about him, but something about his demeanor made her pause. His neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and the lines on his face suggested he was older, but not elderly. His sharp eyes scanned the cabin, taking everything in without a word. "Welcome aboard," Laura said, forcing the warmth back into her voice. He simply nodded again and made his way to seat 14A by the window. As he settled in, Laura made a mental note of him. He seemed like the type who might ask for special accommodations or complain if something didn't go his way. It was just a hunch, but she'd learned to trust her instincts about passengers. Once everyone was seated, Laura and the other attendants began the pre-flight safety demonstration. She noticed the man in 14A watching attentively, his eyes flicking from the demonstration to the safety card in front of him. Most passengers ignored the presentation, but he seemed genuinely interested. It struck her as odd but not noteworthy enough to dwell on. The plane took off smoothly, and soon the attendants were moving down the aisles with drink carts. Laura's focus shifted to ensuring the service ran smoothly. She approached 14A and paused. "Anything to drink, sir?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "Just a glass of water, please," the man said, his voice deep and steady. Laura hesitated for a split second, her eyes scanning the other passengers who were already signaling for drinks. Without thinking, she moved past him. "I'll be back in just a moment," she said briskly, though she had no intention of returning right away. Her mind rationalized the decision. He wasn't demanding, didn't seem upset, and could wait. There were louder, more pressing requests to handle. She worked her way through the cabin, distributing sodas, coffee, and snacks. By the time she finished, she had forgotten about the man in 14A. The flight reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Some passengers worked on laptops, others watched in-flight movies, and a few dozed off. Laura moved through the aisles, occasionally glancing at 14A. The man was staring out the window, his face calm and unreadable. He didn't call for her or try to catch her attention. She dismissed him as one of those low-maintenance passengers who preferred to keep to themselves. Half an hour later, an unexpected announcement crackled through the intercom, breaking the tranquil atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice boomed, "we have the honor of hosting a very special guest on today's flight. Dr. William Preston, a world-renowned neurosurgeon whose groundbreaking work has saved countless lives, is traveling with us." Laura froze mid-step, her tray of drinks trembling slightly in her hands. The captain's words hung in the air, and murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks, whispering and pointing. Her heart sank as she turned her gaze toward 14A. The man in the gray suit was the focus of everyone's attention. He remained seated, his expression unchanged, as if the announcement were about someone else entirely. He gave a polite nod to the curious glances around him, but didn't engage further. Laura felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Dr. William Preston. She had heard of him before. Articles about his innovative brain surgeries had circulated widely in the news. He had been featured in magazines, interviewed on television, and lauded as one of the most brilliant minds in medicine. And she had ignored him. Not just ignored him, dismissed him outright. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The passengers' whispers grew louder, and she could feel their judgment like a spotlight on her back. How could she have been so blind, so quick to judge? The rest of the flight was agony for Laura. Every time she passed 14A, she felt the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. She wanted to say something, to apologize for her oversight, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow or self-serving? To her surprise, Dr. Preston didn't seem to hold any grudge. He remained calm and composed, treating the attention around him as if it were merely background noise. He didn't ask for anything, didn't call her out, and didn't even glance her way. His demeanor only made her feel worse. As the flight progressed, Laura's mind raced. She thought about how easily she had dismissed him based on his quiet nature and unassuming appearance. How many others had she misjudged in the same way? The realization stung. When the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Laura knew she couldn't let the flight end without addressing what had happened. But every scenario she imagined felt awkward and insincere. What if he brushed her off? Or worse, what if he didn't even remember her slight? As the passengers disembarked, Laura positioned herself near the exit, her smile fixed but strained. Dr. Preston approached, his briefcase in hand. He paused briefly in front of her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since boarding. They were sharp, intelligent, and piercing, but there was no trace of anger or reproach. "Thank you for the smooth flight," he said simply, his tone polite but distant. Laura opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Before she could gather her thoughts, he nodded once and stepped off the plane, disappearing into the crowd. She stood there for a moment, stunned. The interaction had been brief, yet it carried a weight she couldn't quite explain. His calm acknowledgement of her, despite her mistake, felt like a quiet lesson in grace and humility. Laura returned to the cabin to help with cleanup, but her mind was elsewhere. She replayed the events of the flight over and over, each time feeling the sting of her actions more acutely. It wasn't just about the water she hadn't brought him. It was about the assumptions she had made. Assumptions that had blinded her to who he truly was. That night, as Laura sat alone in her apartment, she couldn't shake the image of Dr. Preston. She opened her laptop and searched his name. Article after article popped up, detailing his achievements, his charity work, and the lives he had saved. He wasn't just a renowned surgeon. He was a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. Laura leaned back in her chair, her chest heavy with guilt. She realized that this wasn't just about one mistake on one flight. It was a reflection of how often she, and perhaps many others, judged people based on surface-level impressions. She vowed then and there to be different, to do better. Her journey to change had begun, and little did she know, it would lead her to lessons she never expected to learn. Reflections that shape use. The days following the flight with Dr. Preston were a blur for Laura. At work, she went through the motions, fulfilling her duties with precision, but feeling a growing unease. The experience with Dr. Preston lingered in her mind, replaying over and over like a broken record. It wasn't just the embarrassment of being caught in a snap judgment. It was the realization of how deeply ingrained those judgments were in her daily life. On her day off, Laura decided to take a long walk through the city. The air was crisp, and the streets buzzed with the life of strangers going about their day. She watched people shuffle by. A mother juggling 2 toddlers and a grocery bag. A businessman talking animatedly on his phone. A street musician plucking a guitar. For the first time, Laura felt the weight of her assumptions about them. Who were they really? What stories lay beneath the surface? She stopped at a coffee shop, ordered a cappuccino, and found a seat by the window. As she sipped her drink, her mind wandered back to the flight. Dr. Preston's calm demeanor stood out to her. Even when thrust into the spotlight by the captain's announcement, he had handled the situation with a quiet dignity. He hadn't sought attention or corrected her for her oversight. Instead, he had allowed her the space to learn from her mistake without uttering a single reprimand. Grace, she thought. He taught me grace without saying a word. Laura pulled out her phone and opened the search engine. She typed his name again. Dr. William Preston. The article she had skimmed the night of the flight appeared once more, but this time, she dug deeper. She found interviews where he spoke about his work with passion, describing the intricate surgeries he performed and the lives he had saved. There were stories of patients who had regained hope because of his expertise. What struck her most was his humility. He often credited his team and the resilience of his patients rather than taking the spotlight for himself. Scrolling further, she stumbled upon a story that made her pause. It was a profile piece written by a journalist who had spent a week shadowing Dr. Preston at the hospital. The article painted a vivid picture of a man who not only excelled in his field, but also took the time to connect with his patients on a personal level. One excerpt stood out. Dr. Preston doesn't just treat conditions. He treats people. He listens, he empathizes, and he sees the humanity in everyone who enters his operating room. It's not uncommon to see him sitting at a patient's bedside, holding their hand, and reassuring them before a procedure. Laura set her phone down, her chest tight. The more she learned about him, the more she realized how badly she had misjudged him. She had dismissed him as just another quiet, unassuming passenger when, in reality, he was a man whose life was defined by extraordinary compassion and skill. Chance encounter. The following week, Laura returned to work with a renewed determination. She had decided to approach her job differently, not just as a set of tasks to complete, but as an opportunity to connect with people. She reminded herself that every passenger was more than what they appeared to be. Her first test came sooner than expected. It was a late-night flight from Denver to Seattle, and the cabin lights had been dimmed to encourage passengers to rest. Most people were dozing or quietly reading, but one man stood out. He was seated near the front, fidgeting with the in-flight magazine and glancing at his watch every few minutes. His leg bounced nervously, and he muttered to himself under his breath. Laura noticed him during her initial rounds but didn't approach right away. Her first instinct was to assume he was just anxious about flying, a common occurrence, but she caught herself before making any conclusions. Don't assume, just ask. As she passed by with the drink cart, she stopped at his row. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked softly, careful not to startle him. The man looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of tension and gratitude. Just water." "Thank you." Laura poured the water and handed it to him. "Is everything okay? You seem a little unsettled." He hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. It's just been a long day. I'm flying to see my daughter in Seattle. She's in the hospital. It's serious. And His voice broke, and he looked away, embarrassed. Laura felt a pang of sympathy. She knelt slightly to meet his eye level. "I'm so sorry to hear that. It must be incredibly difficult." He nodded, taking a sip of water. "I just keep thinking, what if I'm too late? What if I don't get to say goodbye?" The vulnerability in his voice was palpable, and Laura's heart ached for him. She thought of Dr. Preston and how he might approach this situation, not with solutions, but with presence. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you," she said gently. "But you're here. You're doing everything you can to be there for her. That matters." The man looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "I didn't expect anyone to notice." Laura stayed with him for a moment longer, offering silent support before continuing down the aisle. She glanced back occasionally, noticing that his posture had relaxed slightly. He still looked pained, but there was a hint of calm in his expression. A new perspective. The interaction stayed with Laura for the rest of the flight. She realized how easy it would have been to overlook the man's distress, to chalk it up to routine travel anxiety and move on. But taking a moment to connect with him had made a difference, not just for him, but for her as well. By the time the plane landed in Seattle, Laura felt a strange sense of fulfillment. It wasn't the kind of satisfaction that came from checking off a task or completing a shift. It was deeper, more profound, a reminder of why she had taken this job in the first place. As she stood by the exit, bidding passengers goodbye, the man paused in front of her. His eyes were tired but grateful. "Thank you," he said again, his voice steady now. "For listening. It meant more than you know." Laura smiled warmly. "Take care of yourself, and I hope things get better for you and your daughter." He nodded and walked off, disappearing into the terminal. Laura watched him go, feeling a quiet pride that she had made a small difference in his journey. Lessons in growth. That night, Laura sat on her couch, reflecting on the day. She thought about how much her perspective had shifted since the flight with Dr. Preston. She had always prided herself on being professional and efficient, but now she understood that there was so much more to her role than that. Being a flight attendant wasn't just about serving drinks or enforcing safety protocols. It was about being present for people in moments of vulnerability. Laura picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She hesitated for a moment, then typed out a message to her friend Melissa, who had been one of her biggest supporters during her training. "Hey Mel, I had a moment on today's flight that reminded me why I do this job. It's not about the tasks, it's about the people. Just wanted to share that with you." Melissa's reply came quickly. "Proud of you, Laura. Keep making a difference, one person at a time." Laura smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She didn't know if she would ever see Dr. Preston again, but she carried his lesson with her now, woven into the fabric of who she was becoming. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a chance to see people for who they truly were, to listen, to empathize, and to make even the smallest moments meaningful. Beyond the surface, Laura's shift started as usual, with the clamor of passengers boarding and the familiar buzz of overhead announcements. She greeted each person with a practiced smile, but her newfound sense of purpose gave her actions more weight. She had made a promise to herself. No more snap judgments, no more seeing passengers as just faces in a crowd. It wasn't long before she encountered her first challenge of the day. A young man, barely out of his teens, stumbled onto the plane. His hoodie was pulled up over his head, and his jeans hung low on his hips. He carried a battered duffel bag and reeked faintly of cigarettes. Laura noticed the way he avoided eye contact and mumbled a quick "hi" as he shuffled past her toward his seat. Several other passengers glanced at him, their expressions a mix of annoyance and disapproval. Laura felt the familiar urge to dismiss him as a troublemaker, but she caught herself. No assumptions. Everyone has a story. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Laura noticed the young man fidgeting with the seatbelt. His hands trembled slightly, and he kept glancing nervously out the window. Something about his demeanor caught her attention, not arrogance, but vulnerability. After the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign turned off, Laura approached him. She crouched slightly to meet his eye level, keeping her tone light and approachable. "Hey there, is everything okay?" she asked. "You seem a little uneasy." The young man hesitated, his eyes darting around as if expecting judgment. "Yeah, but it's just my first time flying. Don't really know what I'm doing." Laura nodded, her smile reassuring. "That's okay. It can feel overwhelming at first, but you're doing great. If you have any questions or need anything, just let me know." He relaxed a fraction, giving her a shy smile. "Thanks." The layers of a stranger. Later in the flight, as Laura moved through the cabin with the drink cart, she noticed the young man flipping through a small dog-eared notebook. His brow furrowed in concentration as he scribbled something in the margins. Curiosity tugged at her, but she didn't want to pry. When she reached his row, she offered him a soda. He accepted it with a quiet thanks before hesitating. "Hey, I got a weird question." "Go for it," Laura said, leaning slightly against the seatback. You ever feel like you're running out of chances to fix things? His voice was low, almost a whisper. The question caught Laura off guard. She set the drink cart's brake and gave him her full attention. I think a lot of people feel that way at some point, she said carefully. Is something on your mind? He let out a nervous laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, you could say that. I'm on my way to see my mom. Haven't seen her in a few years. We didn't part on good terms. His voice cracked slightly, and he looked down at the notebook in his lap. She's sick now. I don't know if she's gonna make it. I don't know if I'm too late. The vulnerability in his voice hit Laura like a wave. She thought about the countless passengers she'd served over the years, all with stories she would never know. This time, she had a chance to do something more than just serve a drink. I'm really sorry to hear that, she said softly. It takes a lot of courage to face something like that. Just being there for her now. It matters. More than you might think. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the notebook. After a moment, he held it up, flipping to a page covered in crossed-out lines. I've been trying to write something to say to her, but everything I come up with sounds stupid. Like, hey, sorry for being a terrible son doesn't exactly cut it. Laura's heart ached for him. She thought about the man on the flight to Seattle, about the pain of carrying regrets for too long. Sometimes it's not about saying the perfect thing, she said. It's about showing up, letting her see that you care. The words will come when they need to. The young man looked at her, his expression softening. You think so? I do, Laura said firmly. And if you ever feel like you're running out of chances, just remember, it's never too late to try. The weight of regret. After their conversation, Laura couldn't stop thinking about the young man. She watched him throughout the flight, noting how he occasionally glanced at his notebook or stared out the window, lost in thought. His story reminded her of her own struggles with guilt and redemption. She thought back to Dr. Preston and how his silent grace had left such a profound impact on her. He hadn't scolded her for her mistake or demanded an apology. Instead, his quiet acknowledgement of her growth had taught her more than words ever could. She wondered if she could do the same for others, be a quiet source of encouragement and understanding. A lesson in connection. As the plane began its descent, Laura checked in with the young man one last time. He looked calmer now, his shoulders less tense. Feeling a little better? She asked. Yeah, he said, offering a small smile. Thanks for talking to me. I don't usually. I'm not great at this kind of thing. You did just fine, Laura said. And remember, it's okay to be nervous. You're taking a big step. That's something to be proud of. He nodded, tucking the notebook into his duffel bag. I'll try to remember that. When the plane landed and passengers began disembarking, the young man lingered at his seat. As Laura stood near the exit, saying goodbye to each passenger, he approached her hesitantly. Hey, he said, his voice low. I just wanted to say, thanks for not treating me like a screw-up. Laura's chest tightened. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the gratitude of someone who had been given a sliver of hope in a difficult moment. You're not a screw-up, she said gently. You're just figuring things out, like the rest of us. And for what it's worth, I think your mom will be really glad to see you. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. Thanks. That means a lot. As he stepped off the plane, Laura felt a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't about doing her job well or receiving recognition. It was about making a difference, however small, in someone's life. Reflections that stay. That night, Laura sat by her window, staring out at the city lights. She thought about all the passengers she had served over the years, all the stories she would never know. The young man's vulnerability had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. Every person carries a burden, a story, a hope. Sometimes, all it takes is a moment of kindness to lighten that load. She opened her journal and began to write. Today, I learned that connection isn't about fixing someone's problems. It's about being there, listening, and showing them they're not alone. I hope I can carry that lesson forward, to see people not as passengers, but as stories waiting to be heard. As she set her pen down, Laura felt a quiet sense of peace. She was still learning, still growing, but she knew she was on the right path. The unexpected teacher. The weeks after Laura's flight with the young man passed in a blur, but the memory of their conversation stayed with her. She found herself replaying their exchange during quiet moments, reflecting on the lessons she was learning from her passengers. Each flight brought new faces and new stories, reminding her that her job wasn't just about serving. It was about seeing, listening, and understanding. One particular flight, however, would challenge her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The passenger who wouldn't smile. It was a mid-morning flight from New York to Dallas, and the cabin was bustling with energy. Business people typed furiously on laptops, parents wrangled restless children, and couples whispered to each other as they settled in. Laura moved through the aisle, greeting passengers and checking carry-ons, her usual warm smile firmly in place. When she reached row 22, she noticed a man sitting stiffly by the window. He was in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and a stern expression that seemed permanently etched into his features. He wore a crisp, dark suit and clutched a book in his hands, though he wasn't reading it. His gaze was fixed out the window, and his posture radiated tension. "Good morning, sir," Laura said, her voice cheerful. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" The man didn't look at her. "I'm fine," he said curtly, his tone dismissive. Laura hesitated for a fraction of a second. In the past, she might have let his abruptness bother her, but now she felt a twinge of curiosity. What's his story? She wondered, but she knew better than to push. She nodded and moved on, resolving to check in with him later. Cracks in the armor. Once the flight was in the air, Laura noticed the man in row 22 shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He kept glancing at his watch, and then back out the window, his jaw tight. She decided to approach him again, this time with a different strategy. She crouched slightly by his row, keeping her tone light. "It's a beautiful day for flying, isn't it?" she said, gesturing toward the window. The man turned to her, his expression skeptical. "If you say so." Laura smiled, undeterred. "You seem like you've got a lot on your mind. Long day ahead." He hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. "You could say that." Encouraged by his response, Laura took a seat on the edge of the aisle, careful not to block traffic. "I find that talking about it sometimes helps," she said. "But no pressure, of course." The man studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether she was worth his time. Finally, he set the book in his lap and said, "I'm on my way to my daughter's wedding." Laura's smile widened. "That sounds exciting. Weddings are such happy occasions." The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not when you're the father of the bride who hasn't spoken to her in 3 years." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Laura felt a pang of empathy. She leaned in slightly, her expression softening. "I'm sorry to hear that. Family relationships can be complicated." He let out a bitter laugh. "That's an understatement. She and I had a falling out after her mother passed. We both said things we shouldn't have. And now, here I am, flying halfway across the country to try to make amends before it's too late." Laura nodded, her chest tightening with understanding. She thought about the young man on the previous flight, about the common thread of regret that seemed to bind so many of the people she encountered. "It sounds like you're taking an important step," she said gently. "Showing up matters more than you might think." The man glanced out the window, his expression unreadable. "I just don't know if it'll make a difference. She's probably better off without me." Laura shook her head, her voice firm but kind. "I don't think that's true. The fact that you're here, making the effort, that says a lot. And even if it's hard, even if it takes time, it's worth trying." For the first time, the man's features softened. He looked at Laura, his eyes tired but grateful. "You're very kind," he said quietly. "Thank you." The power of a simple gesture. Throughout the flight, Laura kept an eye on the man in row 22. He seemed less tense now, though he still spent much of the time staring out the window. She wondered what was going through his mind. If he was rehearsing what he would say to his daughter, or if he was simply lost in the memories of their strained relationship. As the plane began its descent into Dallas, Laura decided to do something small but meaningful. She grabbed a piece of paper and a pen from the galley and wrote a note. "Dear Sir, I just wanted to say that I admire your courage in taking this step. Reconnecting with loved ones isn't always easy, but it's one of the most important things we can do. I hope this journey brings you closer to your daughter and that you find the peace you're looking for. With best wishes, Laura." She folded the note and slipped it into a napkin. When she walked past his row to collect trash, she discreetly handed it to him. "This is for you," she said with a smile. "No need to open it now, just something for later." The man looked surprised but accepted the napkin without a word. Laura continued down the aisle, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. She didn't know if her gesture would make a difference, but she hoped it would. A moment of gratitude. After the passengers disembarked, Laura stood at the front of the plane, bidding them goodbye. The man from row 22 was one of the last to leave. As he approached her, he held up the napkin with the note still tucked inside. "I read it," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for this. It means more than you know." Laura felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad it helped," she said softly. "I wish you all the best with your daughter." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "You've given me a lot to think about. Thank you for everything." As he walked away, Laura felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She thought about the stories people carried, the burdens they bore, and how something as simple as a kind word or a listening ear could make all the difference. Lessons in compassion. That night, as Laura sat in her apartment, she reflected on the day's events. She realized that her job was no longer just about ensuring a smooth flight. It was about creating moments of connection, however brief, that could leave a lasting impact. She opened her journal and wrote, "Today, I learned that even the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact. People don't need grand solutions. They need understanding, kindness, and a reminder that they're not alone. I hope I can carry this lesson forward in all that I do." Laura closed the journal and set it aside, a quiet sense of fulfillment settling over her. She didn't know if the man from row 22 would mend his relationship with his daughter, but she knew she had done her part to encourage him. And that, she realized, was enough. The unexpected reunion. The flight attendant's lounge was quieter than usual, with only the hum of distant conversations filling the space. Laura sat by the window, sipping lukewarm coffee as she prepared for her next flight. The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the tarmac, where planes lined up like silent giants ready to take flight. She glanced at her schedule. The flight was a short one, from Atlanta to Nashville, a routine trip with a mix of business travelers and vacationers. Laura felt a sense of calm as she mentally prepared herself for the day. She had grown into her role, no longer nervous or overwhelmed. Instead, she approached each flight with a sense of curiosity. Who would she meet today? What stories would they carry? A familiar name. As Laura scanned the manifest for the flight, her eyes stopped abruptly on a name. Dr. William Preston. Her breath hitched, and the memories of their first encounter flooded back. She had thought of him often since that flight, reflecting on how his quiet grace had left such a lasting impact. And now, here he was again, set to board her flight. Laura's thoughts raced. Would he remember her? Should she say something? Or would it be better to let things play out naturally? She decided to approach the situation as she would with any other passenger, respectfully and without assumptions. The boarding process. As passengers began to board, Laura positioned herself at the front of the plane, greeting each one with her usual warmth. She felt her heart skip a beat when Dr. Preston appeared in the queue, his familiar calm demeanor unchanged. He wore a navy blazer over a light blue shirt, and his leather briefcase hung casually at his side. When it was his turn to board, their eyes met briefly. For a moment, Laura thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his expression, but he said nothing. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Preston," she said with a polite nod, keeping her tone professional. "Thank you," he replied, his voice as measured and steady as she remembered. He moved past her and made his way to his seat, leaving Laura with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Does he remember? An unexpected opportunity. The flight was uneventful at first. Passengers settled in, and Laura moved through the cabin, ensuring everyone was comfortable. Dr. Preston sat in 12A, quietly reading a book. Laura resisted the urge to linger near his row, not wanting to intrude. It wasn't until halfway through the flight that she found an opportunity to interact with him. As she was serving drinks, she noticed that his tray table was empty, and his cup from earlier had been pushed aside. "Dr. Preston, can I get you a refill?" she asked, pausing by his seat. He looked up from his book, his eyes meeting hers. This time, there was no doubt. He remembered her. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Water would be fine." "Thank you," he said. As Laura poured the water, she decided to take a chance. "It's good to see you again," she said softly. Dr. Preston raised an eyebrow, his smile widening slightly. "Ah, I thought you looked familiar. We've flown together before, haven't we?" "Yes, a few months ago," Laura replied. "It was a memorable flight for me." He chuckled, his voice warm. "I hope it wasn't because of something I did." "No, not at all," Laura said quickly. "It was because of something I learned." He nodded thoughtfully, as if he understood. Life has a way of teaching us lessons in unexpected places. Laura hesitated, then added, "If I may, I wanted to thank you. You probably didn't realize it, but that flight had a big impact on me. It made me think about how I approach people, how I see them." Dr. Preston set his book aside, giving her his full attention. "That's kind of you to say, but I think the credit belongs to you. Recognizing the need to change is the first step. Acting on it is the harder part." Laura felt a swell of gratitude. "Thank you. That means a lot." Their conversation was brief, but it left Laura feeling lighter. She returned to her duties with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to carry the lessons she had learned forward. The ripple effect. As the flight neared its end, Laura couldn't help but reflect on how much she had changed since her first encounter with Dr. Preston. She thought about all the passengers she had interacted with since then, the young man flying to see his mother, the father attending his daughter's wedding, and countless others whose stories she would never fully know. Each of them had taught her something about empathy, patience, and the importance of human connection. But what she hadn't realized until now was the ripple effect of those lessons. By becoming more compassionate and present, she had created a space where others felt seen and valued. And in doing so, she had changed not just herself, but also the people around her. A quiet acknowledgement. As passengers began to disembark, Dr. Preston was one of the last to leave. He approached Laura at the front of the plane, his briefcase in hand. "Laura," he said, surprising her by remembering her name. "Thank you for today, and for what you shared earlier. It's always a privilege to meet someone who's willing to grow." Laura felt her cheeks flush. The privilege was mine. "Dr. Preston, safe travels." He nodded, his expression kind. "Until next time." With that, he stepped off the plane, disappearing into the terminal. Laura watched him go, a sense of closure settling over her. She didn't know if there would be a next time, but she was grateful for the second chance to show him how much she had grown. Reflections of the heart. That evening, Laura sat by her window, the city lights twinkling like stars. She thought about Dr. Preston's words and the journey she had been on since their first flight together. It wasn't just about being a better flight attendant. It was about being a better person, seeing others for who they truly were beyond the surface. She opened her journal and wrote, "Sometimes life gives us second chances, not to erase the past, but to show how far we've come. Today, I was reminded that growth is a journey, not a destination. And I'm grateful for every step. As she closed her journal, Laura felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She would keep striving to see the humanity in everyone she met. And in doing so, she hoped to make the world just a little bit kinder. Full circle. Weeks turned into months, and Laura's life continued at the rhythm of airport terminals and in-flight announcements. Each flight felt like a microcosm of human existence, a space where lives briefly intersected before diverging again. The lessons she had learned from her encounters with Dr. Preston, the young man, and countless other passengers stayed with her, shaping her approach to work and life. Despite her growth, there was one lingering thought she couldn't shake. She had never truly thanked Dr. Preston for the role he had played in her transformation. Their second encounter had given her closure, but it also left her wondering if there was more she could do to express her gratitude. An unexpected invitation. One evening, as Laura was scrolling through her emails, a subject line caught her eye. Invitation. Medical Heroes Gala. Dr. William Preston Honoree. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the email. It was a formal invitation to a prestigious event honoring Dr. Preston's contributions to medicine. The airline had received several tickets as a sponsor, and as one of their best-performing flight attendants, Laura had been selected to attend. For a moment, she hesitated. The idea of seeing Dr. Preston again in a setting so different from their usual flights was daunting. What would she say? Would he even remember her? But deep down, she knew she couldn't pass up this chance. The gala. The night of the gala was a whirlwind of elegance and anticipation. The grand ballroom was adorned with crystal chandeliers and tables draped in white linen. Doctors, philanthropists, and dignitaries mingled, their conversations a low hum beneath the soft strains of a string quartet. Laura felt slightly out of place in her formal gown, but she reminded herself why she was there. As she scanned the room, her eyes landed on Dr. Preston, who stood near the stage, engaged in conversation with a small group of people. He looked as composed as ever, his presence commanding yet unassuming. As the evening progressed, the host took the stage to introduce Dr. Preston. The crowd erupted in applause as he approached the podium. His speech was humble and heartfelt, focusing on the importance of compassion in medicine. He shared stories of patients whose resilience had inspired him and emphasized the value of human connection. Laura felt a lump in her throat as she listened. His words resonated deeply, mirroring the lessons she had learned from him. When he finished, the audience gave him a standing ovation, and Laura found herself clapping until her hands ached. A moment of gratitude. After the formalities, Laura mustered the courage to approach Dr. Preston. He stood near a table, sipping water and speaking with another attendee. When their conversation ended, Laura stepped forward. "Dr. Preston," she began, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. He turned to her, his expression lighting up with recognition. "Laura," he said warmly, "it's good to see you again." She smiled, relieved that he remembered her. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I just wanted to thank you properly." "For what?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious. "For everything," Laura said, her voice soft but earnest. "Our first flight together, it changed the way I see people. It made me realize how often I make assumptions and how important it is to approach everyone with empathy. You taught me that without even saying a word." Dr. Preston's gaze softened, and he set his glass down. "You've taken those lessons to heart, haven't you?" "I try to," Laura said. "I've met so many people since then, passengers with their own struggles, their own stories, and every time, I think about how you treated me that day, with grace and understanding. It's something I carry with me every day." He smiled, a quiet pride in his expression. "It's a rare gift to recognize your own growth and to let it shape the way you interact with others. I'm honored to have played a small part in that." Laura felt a surge of emotion. "You've done more than you realize, Dr. Preston. Thank you." He nodded, his demeanor as composed as ever, but Laura could see the genuine appreciation in his eyes. "You're very welcome, Laura. And thank you for sharing this with me. It means more than you know." A full circle moment. As the evening wound down, Laura found herself reflecting on how far she had come. Meeting Dr. Preston had been a turning point, but it was the journey afterward, the people she had met, the stories she had heard, that had truly transformed her. She realized that life wasn't about avoiding mistakes or being perfect. It was about learning, growing, and choosing to see the humanity in others. And sometimes the most profound lessons came from the simplest moments: a quiet acknowledgement, a kind word, a willingness to listen. A new chapter. The next day, Laura returned to the skies with a renewed sense of purpose. She no longer saw her job as just a series of tasks or routines. Instead, she saw it as an opportunity to connect, to learn, and to make a difference, no matter how small. As she greeted passengers and helped them settle into their seats, she felt a quiet confidence in her role. She didn't need grand gestures or perfect words to make an impact. All she needed was the willingness to be present, to listen, and to show kindness. Laura's journey was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain: she was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey ends. After her heartfelt exchange with Dr. Preston at the gala, Laura felt lighter than she had in years. As she walked back to her seat, she replayed his words in her mind. "It's a rare gift to recognize your own growth and to let it shape the way you interact with others." They resonated deeply, affirming the path she had been on since their first encounter. The evening carried on with laughter, conversations, and a sense of celebration for the lives Dr. Preston had touched. But for Laura, the true gift of the night wasn't just meeting him again. It was realizing how much she had changed, and the ripple effect of that change on the people she encountered. Returning to the skies. The following week, Laura returned to her usual routine, but everything felt a little brighter. She moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose, her interactions with passengers more thoughtful and deliberate. The stories she had heard from the people she served now shaped the way she approached every moment. On a quiet flight from Denver to San Francisco, Laura found herself seated beside a fellow flight attendant during the cruise break. Her colleague, Sarah, was relatively new to the airline and carried the nervous energy Laura remembered all too well from her early days. "You're so calm with passengers," Sarah said, her voice tinged with admiration. "How do you do it? I always feel like I'm one misstep away from making someone upset." Laura smiled, thinking back to the journey that had brought her to this point. "It wasn't always that way," she admitted. "I've made my share of mistakes. But I learned something important along the way. Every passenger has a story. Sometimes they're struggling with things we can't see. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing compassion." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I never thought of it that way. I guess it's easy to forget that passengers are more than just faces in a crowd." "It is," Laura agreed. "But once you start looking beyond the surface, it changes everything. And you'll find that even the smallest kindness can make a big difference." The final lesson. Laura's words to Sarah echoed her own transformation, but it wasn't until a few flights later that she truly understood the full circle of her journey. On a flight from Chicago to Boston, Laura noticed a woman sitting alone near the back of the plane. The woman looked tired, her face lined with worry. She clutched a small photo frame in her hands, her knuckles white as she stared out the window. Something about her struck Laura, a quiet sorrow that seemed to envelop her. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Laura approached her with a warm smile. "Hi there," she said gently. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" The woman looked up, startled, and shook her head. "No, thank you," she said softly. Laura hesitated, sensing there was more beneath the surface. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask," she said, her tone inviting. The woman nodded but didn't respond. Laura moved on, but her thoughts lingered on the woman's quiet sadness. Later, as she passed by again, She noticed tears glistening in the woman's eyes. Unable to ignore it, she stopped and crouched by her seat. "Are you okay?" Laura asked gently. The woman hesitated, then held up the photo frame. It was a picture of a young man in a military uniform, his smile radiant. "My son," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm flying to Boston for a memorial service. He didn't make it home." Laura's heart clenched. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He looks like he was an incredible person." The woman nodded, her tears spilling over. "He was. He always wanted to make the world a better place. And now, I just feel so lost." Laura reached out, placing a comforting hand on the woman's shoulder. "I can't imagine the pain you're feeling, but I want you to know that his service, his sacrifice, it matters. And so does your grief. You're not alone in this." The woman's lip quivered, but she managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Full circle. As Laura walked away, she felt a sense of profound connection. The conversation reminded her of the countless passengers who had opened up to her over the years. The young man flying to see his estranged mother, the father attending his daughter's wedding, the elderly man facing his fears. Each story had left its mark on her, shaping the person she had become. She realized that her journey had come full circle. The lessons she had learned from Dr. Preston and her own experiences had allowed her to create a space where others felt seen, heard, and valued. In doing so, she had found a deeper purpose in her work, a purpose that extended far beyond the cabin of a plane. A quiet reflection. That evening, as Laura sat by her apartment window, she opened her journal one last time. The words flowed easily, capturing the essence of her journey. "Today, I learned that kindness isn't about grand gestures. It's about being present, listening, and showing empathy. Every passenger, every person, carries a story, and when we take the time to see them, we remind them, and ourselves, that we're not alone." This journey has taught me that growth isn't a destination. It's a path we walk every day, one small act of compassion at a time. As she closed the journal, Laura felt a quiet sense of peace. Her journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. She knew that as long as she carried these lessons with her, she would continue to make a difference. One flight, one passenger, one story at a time.